History is unforgiving on political careers. Is it too early to evaluate Joe Biden's term of office? Or is the verdict all too clear? Will Joe Biden go down as a footnote or as a chapter heading in world history? Join me, Jan Darash, for How We Got Here.
Joe Biden began his presidential term with the promise of unity and healing, aiming to steer the United States through a post-pandemic recovery and to restore trust in the government. He assumed office in January 2021, just 2 weeks after rioters sought to keep Donald Trump in power during a period marked by surging COVID-19 deaths and widespread pessimism. Shortly after, vaccines began curbing infections and the economy started to recover. However, this progress was short-lived. A new virus variant caused the number of cases to rise again. The withdrawal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan drew sharp criticism, and soaring prices soon followed. Now, as he prepares to leave office, his approval ratings remain strikingly low, even by the already diminished standards of recent presidencies. Throughout his term, Biden's average approval rating hovered at 42%, with a December 2024 rating of 39%, mirroring Donald Trump's rating at the end of his presidency. January 20 marks the end of Biden's administration, but as he departs, the question arises: how will his presidency be remembered? One of Biden's successes is healthcare expansion. Biden doubled the number of Americans with affordable healthcare. Nearly 25 million Americans signed up for coverage during the 2025 open enrollment period, comparing to 12 million in the Trump administration's final year. Despite inflation challenges, Biden has also overseen consistent job growth, becoming the first president to see net job creation every month in office. In his final year, more than 2 million jobs were added. Biden also championed support for Ukraine during Russia's invasion. While controversial among MAGA Republicans, his stance resonated with the majority of Americans who supported aid to the war-torn country. To date, the U.S. has provided almost $66 billion in military assistance. On the contrary, inflation remained a persistent issue during Biden's term, averaging 5.4% annually. This economic strain became a focal point for criticism, with 41% of Americans in 2024 identifying it as their top financial concern. Adding to the list of Biden's failures is the abrupt U.S. exit from Afghanistan in August 2021, which to this day is widely criticized. While the majority supported leaving, the chaotic execution damaged Biden's credibility, with 69% of Americans disapproving of his handling of the situation. Another thing is immigration. Efforts to address immigration reform stalled amid partisan gridlock, leading to declining confidence in Biden's ability to manage the issue effectively, and millions of illegal migrants crossing the U.S. border. Finally, Biden's decision to remain in the 2024 race, despite waning support, drew criticism, culminating in a poor debate performance that potentially tarnished his legacy. The recent passing of President Jimmy Carter serves as a reminder that presidential legacies can evolve over time. While Biden's presidency may be reassessed in the years ahead, he likely won't have the extended opportunity to reshape public perception that Carter did. A more recent example of political resurgence unfolded over a shorter time frame, one that Biden is unlikely to replicate: Trump's.
Today I welcome as our guest Aaron Korewa, the Director of the Warsaw Office of the Atlantic Council. Welcome once more.
Thank you for having me.
We're doing a kind of a summary, if it's possible, if it's not too early even, about the legacy of President Biden, outgoing president. The reports I've read don't seem to paint his presidency, or the end of his presidency, in a favourable light. They seem to concentrate on his declining mental faculties. Is that, in your opinion, accurate? And it can't be just the fact that the president is declining and he's failed in many foreign policy initiatives. there must be something more that he's accomplished over his...
Oh, sure. I mean, it wouldn't be fair to sum up the entire presidency like that. And it's obvious why this is what people talk about, because it had such a major impact on his decision not to run again.
Yes.
And we, of course, all know the story of that. And that is going to be a problem for his legacy. This is not the way I think President Biden wanted to exit. This is not the way he planned it. This is not the way people around him planned it either. Joe Biden, let's remember, ran for president several times. He spent many decades working to get to the presidency. And I think, unfortunately for him, he was never anybody's first choice for president. He kept being the second choice. In many ways, I think he got the nomination 4 years ago because he was seen as the one who could beat Trump. But again, it's kind of like the one who can beat Trump, not that people were that enthusiastic about him. I think that he and the people around him misread that completely. I cannot verify this, but of course there are all these stories of people telling him that he could be as impactful as President Roosevelt, right, or something like that, or even LBJ, and that was never in the cards. And when yes, he didn't explicitly say that he was going to run for one term, but a lot of people expected him to be a transitional president, and when that never happened, it kind of, well, made it look like he overstayed his welcome. That being said, there are several mainly domestic legislative achievements. Not an expert in this. I'm not an expert in this field, but if we look at the infrastructure bill, the CHIPS Act is another example of manufacturing semiconductors in the United States. These are things that can have a major impact way down the line, and so the presidency can be reassessed. But specifically, if we look at foreign policy, and particularly considering that Joe Biden had this history of being chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Senate for a very long time.
Yes, I think we must remember he was a astute Washington insider for much of his career.
Yes, yeah. If you look at the foreign policy legacy, that is at best mixed, and unfortunately, I would say slight leaning towards the negative. The withdrawal from Afghanistan, again, not entirely Biden's fault. He was put in a very difficult position, in part by the Doha deal, which was made by President Trump, which in many ways is a very bad deal, completely undercut the Afghan government. But that doesn't mean that the execution of the withdrawal made by Joe Biden was really bad, and his presidency never really recovered from that. And of course, later comes the open aggression against Ukraine.
Yes, was that sending the signal to Russia that somehow the United States makes weak decisions? For example, like the U.S. ambassador to Kuwait seemingly giving the green light to Saddam Hussein's invasion. It seems he sent out the wrong signal from Afghanistan in particular.
Certainly. I mean, I don't blame the Russians for believing that, look, Afghanistan proves that somehow we're not going to stick by a country that we did invest a lot in. I completely understand why the Russians read it that way, and this is why it was such a problem. This is why people like me and others when this was under discussion, I kept hearing people saying, "Well, what does Afghanistan really matter?" It's like, well, it's not just about Afghanistan. That's not how the world works. You can't do something like that and then say, "Well, what happens in Afghanistan stays in Afghanistan." No, it doesn't. Of course, everybody else is watching. That's why it matters. And if we specifically look at the Russian aggression against Ukraine, I mean, sure. Biden did rally NATO and the NATO allies. He did deliver excellent speeches in Warsaw twice, one in Vilnius. Very good. Problem was he didn't do that in the United States. I mean, this is something that had to be repeated and travel all over the country, repeat the message. For example, we're not giving tons of money to Ukraine. We were investing in our own defense production. I mean, how hard can that possibly be to explain? Well, it needs to be explained. It needs to be repeated over and over again. And this goes back to the question of his age. It seems like he just wasn't up to the job of traveling all over the country and delivering speeches over and over again. I mean, that's just a fact of life, but that is a key part of the job of being. I
think you can say that President Biden's decline showed us all that you can't fight the laws of nature. You can't fight the laws of biology, I suppose. What about the other theatres in the world? America is a global power. China, the Middle East. How does President Biden measure up against these two major?
Well, if we look at
theaters?
China first, I mean, there was an interesting summit between Biden and Xi in San Francisco towards the later part of Biden's presidency, where several people made the interesting observation that a lot of the problems that China is facing right now, it's not really a policy of ours, it's rather their own policy, yes. and that they're just having to reap what they sow. And we've been for this Biden deserves credit of working and building maintaining the alliances in the Indo-Pacific. But again, a lot of that is just capitalizing on the fact that the Chinese keep shooting themselves in the foot over and over again. I mean, when you look as far as the Middle East is concerned, that it really is in many ways a negative legacy, simply because, how to put it, it seemed that they tried to sort of make everyone happy at the same time. Like, we support Israel, but we are critical. Yeah. We push back against Iran, but we don't push back very hard, and so on and so forth. If you try to make everyone satisfied, you end up satisfying nobody, often. The protests against Joe Biden are I mean, I would bet that once Donald Trump is in office, and he's been openly saying we back Israel to the hilt, there's not going to be as many protests against him simply because they would think that this is ineffective, right? So I mean, why it kind of becomes this you're trying to satisfy every member of a coalition, you end up satisfying no one at all.
Aren't we in danger of seeing the United States president, any president, as the great world figure, very powerful individual, but ultimately they have a very limited influence over these, as you say, the deeper undercurrents, the policies of other countries such as China. They have a limited effect on influencing the world.
Well, if you look at, I mean, take a good example of when we're talking about Ukraine again and Russia, because that's the topic I know the best. I mean, again, it would be very hard to deter Russia from attacking Ukraine prior to the open invasion. Again, we talk about Afghanistan. I mean, there's a lot of things going on in Russia and in Ukraine itself. That, for instance, the fact that in April, I believe 2021, Putin called a meeting of his National Security Council after Zelensky arrested a few pro-Russian oligarchs in Ukraine. That's something that's completely underreported in the West because it's not about us. But again, probably matters a lot in Russia, right? That he saw that Ukraine is slipping away from the Russian grip, so he has to try to take it back in again. And again, he looks at the United States. He looks at our debacle in Afghanistan. The Germans are going to elect a new untested chancellor. The French were going to have their presidential election. Boris Johnson. Nobody likes Boris Johnson because of Brexit. Nobody listens to Poland. So why not? Ukraine is weak. Why not? The problem is that once that happened, there's a little influence on that, perhaps. But once he did that, what the United States should have done is, again, worked hard to back Ukraine all the way and push Russia, make sure that Russia loses the war and Ukraine wins. In Bob Woodward's latest book, I believe it's called War, and we can take this with a grain of salt because it's a book and all that, but it says that on the eve of the war, the reaction from Joe Biden was, oh no, do we now have to deal with the Russian invasion of Ukraine as well? Well, the proper reaction to that is, obviously no one's happy about the war, but our enemy has just made a major strategic mistake. We need to capitalize on that. We need to hit the enemy really hard instead of being worried about what's going to happen. Should Russia fall apart? Yada, yada. Yeah, this is, again, if Russia falls, it falls. We can deal with that. We dealt with the Soviet Union falling, turned out just fine, right? This was a moment to capitalize on it, and we could have capitalized on this moment. We could have scored a major strategic victory against our enemy, and instead, it became there was too little, too late, right?
Yes,
the decisions took forever. Most of the decisions that we discussed years ago have now been made, but they're being made now. They should have been made earlier.
And I suppose to round up the Russian angle, it seemed that President Biden wanted victory, but wanted to maintain Russia as a state. And it seemed that the two weren't compatible often.
Well, exactly. I mean, and again, you got to prioritize. The priority is winning the war. What happens with Russia, it will happen. What will happen, we'll handle it. It's manageable. But, we might have to open a few new offices over at the State Department. So what? It's manageable. We did the same mistake originally with the Soviet Union, by the way. I mean, there's George Bush's famous Chicken Kiev speech, which the Ukrainians still hold against him, for obvious reasons. It's pretty funny because, of course, the Russian charge is that we somehow wanted to destroy the Soviet Union. Quite the contrary, we did a lot to preserve the Soviet Union. It was mainly the people of the Soviet Union that destroyed it. But that's again, there are moments where you have to look further than the immediate problem.
Difficult for a democratic leader always to do, isn't it? They always keep looking to the next election. Mm-hmm. Well, what were the major turning now to the domestic front? What were the major domestic economic achievements of President Biden, in your opinion?
Well, I think I mentioned the CHIPS Act. I think it's going to be
being forced through almost as we speak.
Mm-hmm, exactly, and of course, some of the infrastructure decisions. Again, I'm not an expert on this topic, but a lot of the infrastructure decisions are going to have a positive effect further down the line. But this is exactly part of the problem, right? That you're not going to see it early on in 4 years. Same thing with a lot of the economic decisions. Of course, they led to inflation on the short term. But if you look at the U.S. economy and you compare it to other parts of the world, the U.S. is doing pretty well economically. Yes,
he continued President Trump's legacy almost as economically.
That too, yes.
Is President Biden, do you think, going to be seen as the in-between guy who sits between President Trump's first presidency, and Trump the sequel?
Well, it certainly looks
kind of a transitional.
Certainly looks that way right now, but of course, that a lot of that depends on how we're going to view the Trump presidency, presidencies. That's still an unwritten page in many ways. Again, could Biden be positively reevaluated further down the line, like certain other presidents did? Yes, but it will also depend on factors beyond his control.
Yes, it's all the historical stuff which is beyond our lifetimes, I suppose. Aaron Koreva, thank you very much for your evaluation of President Biden.
Thanks.
Thank you for coming on to the program. So that's it for today. Do join us next time for How We Got Here.